I think we're all here now. Great. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Welcome to our Meet the Author event and to the UN Bookshop. My name is Mary Glenn. I'm Chief of UN Publications, and among my roles, I'm lead this beautiful bookshop here where all the products are sustainable and the profits go directly back to the organization. So we hope you enjoy. This book is Environmental Lobbying at the UN, at the United Nations, A Guide to Protecting Our Planet, by Felix Dodds and Chris Spence, who are no strangers to book publishing and to the UN Bookshop as well. This timely book does exactly what it says on the cover. It's a step-by-step guide by insiders on how to lobby and engage successfully at the United Nations, revealing how the UN, who plays such a key role in fighting climate change, really works. As Chantal Carpentier of the United Nations Trade and Development says, this is an essential resource for anyone striving to navigate UN complex processes and help influence the environmental agenda. It's very fitting that we have this book launched during high-level political forum, which of course focuses on the SDGs. I would like to introduce our moderator, Maria Figueroa Kupchu, who is on this page, who is founding partner of Helia Advisors. Is that how you pronounce that? Great, and she's going to come up here. We'll change places, and she will introduce the rest. You guys can introduce yourselves. Great, thank you very much. We'll talk for about 35 minutes. We'll have Q&A for 10 minutes, and then please, if you'd like to buy, the books are available for purchase, and the authors would love to sign them for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. As Mary Ellen said, my name is Maria Figueroa Kupchu. I'm a founding partner of Helia Advisors, which is a strategy and communications firm focused on environmental sustainability. But more importantly, my first job was here at the United Nations, UNDP. So for any interns in the room, I know there's one over there, you'll have looking forward to a wonderful, blissful career in international affairs. And that's why I'm so excited to be here to help very dear friends launch their book today. We thought that we would spend about half an hour in conversation. I know you both have some reflections that you'd like to share about the book and what brought you to write it and why it's important right now. And then we are joined by two discussants, Zach Bleicher and Sophie Riggs, who have their own deep experience in the multilateral process and want to share a few of their reflections. And then we'd love to open it up for questions and conversations with the group. So first, let me just introduce our authors. Felix is no stranger to the UN. How long has it been since when was the first time you stepped foot in the UN?
I'm guessing 1990.
1990. A veteran, so an adjunct professor at the University of North Carolina's Water Institute. He's a consultant advising stakeholders on their UN strategies and campaigns of many different types. He's also someone who's conducted numerous capacity building exercises and workshops for stakeholders so that they can be more effective in these negotiations. And he's edited or co-written 26 books, many of which are on the shelves here of the UN Bookshop. The last two were with Chris Spence, a fruitful collaboration. And Felix has also served as chair of the first UN conference to propose a set of indicative sustainable development goals, and you can see a lot of the swag for sale here in this bookshop. Proof that little germs of ideas can really turn into very consequential work, which is part of the theme that we're going to be talking and exploring today. He was executive director of the Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future from 1992 to 2012. Several of the staff members are here today representing that organization. And he's been an advocate, a policy maker, and a futurist. And there are very few people, I think, who care so deeply about making the multilateral system work. And so we're grateful that you're here and that you're going to be sharing your insights. Chris is an environmentalist, a writer, a former leader of nonprofits across New York, New Zealand, California has had broad experience, and this has included several roles heading nonprofit organizations, but also being really deep in the UN system, following the multilateral negotiations and reporting on them. He's been instrumental in the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, which is a must-read for people here who follow these and cited several times in the book. He's been a consultant to the UN, the IUCN, the IISD, and working in over 40 countries. In addition, he wrote his own book, his first one, Global Warming, Personal Solutions for a Healthy Planet, and co-edited with Felix, Heroes of Environmental Diplomacy, Profiles in Courage, also must read for those engaged in multilateralism. I want to maybe turn to you both to first kick us off with some reflections from you about, why this book now? Felix, you started this theme in this book in 2004, right? It was the first time that you kind of put together thoughts to help stakeholders engage more effectively with what is a very complex and sometimes bureaucratic system. I say that in jest. And now you brought this book forward to 2025. It's basically a different book, right? We're in a different time. The way that the UN works has evolved and changed a lot because of the work that you all have done over the years. So we just wanted to kick off first with, tell us why you felt compelled to write this book now, and then Chris will add his own reflections and maybe tell us a little bit more also about what you decided to put in this book and how it can help stakeholders. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Maria. There was a previous book to this, which some people may have bought, called How to Lobby at Intergovernmental Meetings. This came out in 2004, and then the subtitle was Mine's a Cafe Latte. And, of course, all of you here know why that's in the title, because that's where a lot of the discussions happen. But the publisher refused to put it on the front page. But it did get picked up by a lot of coffee websites because it had the name coffee in it, so I wasn't that upset. But I wanted to talk to you here and say it's a pleasure that I've had in working with the UN over these years, with member states, with UN staff who are amazing, and with stakeholders on many of the critical issues that have challenged us since the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. Over the years, I think we've accumulated, me and Chris, a set of knowledge on how to advocate for policy, both in positive and in more difficult time periods. And if you look at my writing on sustainable development, we've covered through the book I did with Maurice Strong and with called Only One Earth, and then from Rio +20 to the New Development Agenda, and the negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals, we've tried to show not just what happened, but to recognize that you're negotiating these in a real political world. And you have to understand the real political world that you're operating in to see what is possible. And so I say that as we move towards 2030. And it was Winston Churchill who said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that's very relevant with the UN 80 discussions. And we now face a triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution. And we are seeing, even in this difficult time period, the creation of new conventions. Hopefully in August we'll see the final agreement on the Plastics Convention. So it's even in difficult times you can move processes forward. The idea, I think, originated between Chris and me because we felt we've learned all this information, and we want the next generation to be able to learn from what we've done. Now, some of it may not be as useful to you, but we hope by kind of decanting our brains and also our friends' brains who helped us to look at it, that in some way that will give you a better chance to be more successful than we have done. The book has some tricks of the trade on what to do, and a lot of it's related to coffee drinking. I want to briefly just mention a couple of the chapters. So as a stakeholder lobbyist, you need to understand, why are you coming to this meeting? We have a chapter that goes into the different reasons. I believe there's too much what I call conference tourism. If you don't need to go without a clear idea of what you will achieve, then don't go. For example, I'm not attending COP30. Not because COP30 isn't essential, it's amazingly essential. But I don't have a particular issue that I'm following that will be coming up at those negotiations. I did have a workshop at the pre-meeting in Bonn in June to push off a process that will actually not go to COP30, but will go to the UN Environment Assembly. So also look for where your issue actually has the best chance to be influential. In the book, we talk about 4 areas, that stakeholders can play. Setting agendas, and we give some case studies. When Stakeholder Forum did its workshop in San Sebastian in 2008 on the idea of Rio Plus 20, we came up with what ultimately became the themes of that particular conference. So the earlier you're engaged in the process, the better. If you're involved with negotiating the outcomes, then clearly the first meeting, or even prior to that first meeting, is crucial. That you are talking to governments before they get to their position, and then when you're there, as you move towards the end of a negotiation, your ability to impact is, of course, reduced. We also confer legitimacy. If a particular body of the UN isn't doing what it should be doing, we can talk about reform, and that happened with the Commission on Sustainable Development. The stakeholders said, we no longer see this as a viable body, and ultimately they saw the creation of the high-level political forum. And then many of the organizations are involved in implementing solutions, and so those are really important. We have a chapter on what it's like to be a government official. So, we have our little lobbying that we're doing, but the governments are also lobbying. They're lobbying other governments to support their position. But you have to understand, in a sense, where the governments are coming from to be able to not only persuade them, but also potentially to help them. Because you should be recognizing that not everything can be achieved in the meeting that you want, and maybe that government is under a particular political leadership that makes your issue not able to be moved forward. That's not the fault of the civil servants who are working for the government. That's the political party that's in power. And so always work with those government officials or with the civil servants of that government because the government will change. And then if you've built that relationship in a period when it's difficult, they'll remember that you were still working with them and trying to find ways forward. So Monday this week, Chris and I had an article out with Interpress Service, which looked at the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity, and chemicals and waste. And we argued to build on the original vision of Klaus Topfer when he was head of UNEP and of Achim Steiner, that we need to have an idea of bringing the environmental conventions together, to cluster them. This is part of what I think is a legitimate approach to UN 80. Even though it's difficult at this particular point, we should look for good ideas that are out there and to build on them. And as the journalist Walter Lippmann said in 1955, if right or wrong depends on what people feel, then we're outside the bounds of civilization. And so we advocate very much for a science-based approach. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Felix. Thanks for breaking that down. Chris, do you want to add some thoughts too?
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Great. Well, I just want to talk about 3 things in the next 5 or 6 minutes. The first one is gratitude. The second thing I want to talk about briefly is why we wrote this book and why now, why it's particularly relevant at this moment in time. And then the last thing is just, I want to reflect just briefly, and we may get into this more in the Q&As, I don't know, but it's just about the future of multilateralism and the future of the UN, which feels somewhat precarious right now, so I want to talk about that briefly. So just to begin, much of my involvement, and Maria's mentioned the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, so much of my involvement with the UN over the past 27 years, yeah, quite a long time, I just realized I said that out loud, past quarter century plus two, has been through the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, the ENB. Just a quick show of hands, who here kind of is familiar with the ENB and their work? Okay, so a good sprinkling of people. Just for those who don't know, just very briefly, it's a neutral, independent reporting service that sends teams of experts, teams of writers, photographers, and Kira, it's very nice to see you here today, and sometimes videographers to record, to analyze, and to reflect on what's going on at major multilateral environmental negotiations and also meetings like HLPF, which is occurring right now on sustainable development. And it's been going since the Rio Earth Summit. So it's a 30-plus-year-old organization, and it does terrific work following all of these key meetings and negotiations and explaining how did we get these agreements? You know, why did they happen? Who came to the table and made them happen? When they didn't happen, what occurred that prevented them? So a lot of my time, my last quarter century involved with the UN has been as an observer, as a writer, as an editor, as an analyst, as someone essentially watching what's going on in this system. Now, another person who I started to see early on in the late 1990s at many of these meetings was my co-author, Felix Dodds. Now, Felix, unlike me, he had a different role. I saw him as an actor and as an activist. He was a lobbyist, a change maker, an influencer. He was very caffeinated a lot of the time because a lot of his kind of influencing and building these brilliant relationships with delegates and with stakeholders occurred at the Vienna Cafe and other UN places where you can get coffee. So I just want to thank Felix for, firstly, for being such a great co-author on this book, for bringing so many of the ideas to this. He's lived this. I've seen him have an incredibly positive influence on everything from the climate negotiations to forming the SDGs, to the MDGs before the SDGs, and so his influence goes back a long way, so thank you. I just wanted to speak just very briefly about why we wrote this book and why we wrote it at this moment. So Felix has mentioned some of the practical skills that you can learn from reading this book, some of the practical advice, some of the guidance for how you can enter the UN world, how you can influence what's going on in these important meetings. We hope it's a great introduction to folks coming new to the UN. We hope it's a great refresher with some new information for those who are veterans. It's also a passionate argument for why multilateralism and international cooperation matter now more than ever before. There's this quote that probably many of you have heard: if the UN didn't exist, we would have to invent it. And that is true now more than it ever has been. It's the only way to address these global challenges. It's the only way that we can deal with climate change. It's the only way we can deal with biodiversity loss or widespread pollution, plastic pollution. It is the way we have already successfully addressed the ozone challenge that would have led to, global disaster by now if we hadn't have done that. Just another quick show of hands. So who here is involved in the UN world in some shape or form, whether it's a delegate, a UN staffer, an intern, a stakeholder? Who here is involved in the UN world and multilateralism in some shape or form? I just want to thank all of you. I want to thank you because it's just an incredibly important thing that you are all doing. And I want to quote what Elizabeth Maruma said in the foreword to our book. She said, "There's no role so honorable as striving to make the world better." And in my view, there's no better way to do this than to committing to multilateralism and to the UN system. So I just want to thank all of you. Just the last thing I just want to touch on is is the future of multilateralism, and we might get into this in more detail. I don't want to spend too much time because I think I've already been up here for too long. But some people are saying multilateralism's dead. A handful of leaders have declared that the UN is irrelevant. But I believe that most countries and most people would disagree. I believe that most people recognize that humanity thrives when we cooperate and we collaborate, not when we fight and not when we compete in an antagonistic way. Most people know that win-win is better than zero-sum game. And I've seen, even in the last few, there's this scientific term, right? That, for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. And I think that we're getting a reaction to that kind of unilateral declaration that multilateralism is dead. I think we're seeing that already. I could give several examples, but one that I was just talking with a good friend of mine about was the High Seas Treaty, which is about marine biodiversity. The High Seas Treaty affects half of the world's planet. It's about protecting marine biodiversity and marine life. And it was first agreed over 2 years ago. But since January of this year, we've seen an incredible spike in the number of countries ratifying that. It's now up to about 49 or 50. And I think that it will enter into force as an internationally legally binding treaty when it hits 60 ratifications. And I think that part of the reason why that treaty is getting so much support is because many countries and many people are realizing that multilateralism is our best way forward, and that the UN matters now more than ever, and that we really need to double down on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. I think one of the things that really I enjoyed about the book is it paints this strong defense of multilateralism, as you've just talked about, but it also gives you very, very practical, actionable things to do. It is literally a blueprint for how to navigate these halls effectively, and coupling that with some of the stories that you speak to over the course of your careers, where those things have worked effectively or where they haven't worked effectively, I think gives a really just a great capsule for someone who is both new to this whole process and needs to read it from top to bottom, but also for people who've been at this for a while and just need to be refreshed, a little bit in how things are changing. As you all think about your questions, I want to invite two folks to reflect on this book, Sophie and Zach. So let me just introduce quickly and maybe get your impressions about the book or some additional thoughts you wanted to share. So Sophie is a climate policy and governance expert. She's been in this world for almost 2 decades, working across sectors and continents. She's currently serves as the strategy lead for mobilizing an Earth Governance Alliance. She's a G20 advisor to the UN Office for Disaster Risk and Reduction, and she's been co-chair of the Climate Action Network based in the UK and now works here in New York. And Zach Bleicher, who I've also known for many years, has spent quite a long time in the UN system, almost over 18 years, and really has been at the intersection of efforts around resilient food systems and climate action. He is currently working as a global engagement lead at the Food Action Alliance, which came out of the COP28, where he was in the president's office. He's had a front row seat to many multilateral efforts as head of the New York office and senior partnerships officer for IFAD. And he's helped lead consultations on COP28 UAE Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture, Resilient Food Systems, and Climate Action, which was ultimately endorsed by 160 heads of states of government. So both of them have been in and around these discussions and negotiations as stakeholders, as close members to government delegations, engaging with a variety of actors, and wanted just to get their perspective on the book and kind of what stood out with them, or some reflection. So maybe Sophie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to the discussion. And as has been said, sorry, actually, is this working? Great. I come at this maybe a bit more from a sort of civil society perspective, and very focused also on the sort of climate change part of the puzzle, so the UNFCCC negotiations, where I've spent most of my time. And I'll start by saying, and not just because I've known Felix for some time now, but I do think that this book should be sort of required reading, and especially for anyone that's sort of new to this space. I think if I had had the opportunity to read it when I'd first started out, I think it would have saved a lot of time and confusion and probably also tears. But I think what's really struck me when reading the book, and now after several years of engaging in this space, I still find it's sort of deeply clarifying and still incredibly useful. But I think that what it brings is that it enables confidence as well. And I think that especially within the civil society space, the climate diplomacy space can be incredibly intimidating and quite hard to break into. And you get these sort of experts that sort of own particular areas and that are sort of gatekeepers within the UNFCCC. And I think that reading this book really provides that confidence that you need to manage those gatekeepers and to be able to enter with confidence. And I think that that's so important because we need these new voices at this time in particular, and people coming in from different sectors. But it is a really hard space to break into, and that's where I think where the book really brings out its like true gem, is giving you that confidence to sort of take action forward and to engage. But there are three sort of elements of the book where I would just like to sort of say a few words, and three themes that really sort of stood out to me, especially within the current context of this current geopolitical climate that we find ourselves in, and the attack against multilateralism. And the first is around the role of networks. So the book offers an honest overview of the benefits and trade-offs of working with civil society networks, major groups, and constituencies. And they even include a helpful sort of table that sort of outlines those pros and cons. And I come from working as co-chair of the board of the Climate Action Network, and have spent some time also on the board of the Global Network for Disaster Reduction. So I am an advocate for networks, and I see that they are incredibly powerful, but particularly at this current time where we're seeing civic space shrink and the availability of resources to climate-focused organizations really diminish. And the role of working within networks, I think it really helps us to pull that capacity to share information more rapidly and coordinate strategies, and really to punch above our weight. But these networks are obviously not without their challenges. And I think, again, with the experience that I've had, I think it's very obvious to me now how the internal politicking can stall momentum, and how divergent priorities can sort of stop work to the point of paralysis. And I think these dynamics that we're seeing play out in the global sort of world, as it were, between governments, are also playing out between civil society networks as well. And these fractures are increasing at a time where we really need networks to come together. And so it's really a moment to ask, how can we work more effectively, and how can we leverage the strengths and minimize the constraints of working as networks? And this is where, again, I think the book is incredibly useful, because it really helps to, whilst these answers there are no easy answers to this, it helps us navigate that and to work much more effectively together. The second point that I think the book really brings out is around matching strategy to the stage of the process. And I think that's really key at the moment in particular, whereas within the UNFCCC system, we're shifting from a focus on negotiations to a focus on implementation. And we all know that we need far more implementation. And I think what's interesting from a civil society perspective is, what does that mean for us? Does it mean that we need to spend more time with parliamentarians and not just negotiators at the international level? Maybe step back from some of the glitzy big meetings and go back a bit more to the domestic level, look at the accountability at that level. And also shift it very much from that ratcheting up ambition to what is the sort of guidance, and how should we be working with decision makers and providing them that credible advice on pathways for implementation. And so my point being is that our tactics as civil society really need to evolve as the process evolves, or we risk becoming irrelevant. And again, I think the book is a key sort of support in helping civil society think that through and to answer those questions. And then just finally, maybe just a moment of sort of self-reflection, coming to some of the points that Chris has already highlighted, and speak to the point that the book touches on as well, and that feels increasingly urgent, and that is, of course, this retreat from multilateralism, and how climate is also falling down the political agenda. And it's really interesting because recent conversations I've had with philanthropists at a very senior level have really demonstrated how the philanthropy sector is taking this moment as a point of self-reflection and really analysing the last 2 decades of their investments. Has it been worth it? What impact have they had? But I'm not yet seeing that level of self-reflection happen in the civil society space. And I think it's something that we really need to do. And I think, some of the questions I have is around, have we clearly communicated the value of multilateralism in the UNFCCC? And as the book highlights, it's a huge jump that we've done. If we didn't have the Paris Agreement and the surrounding architecture, we would be on a 5 degrees trajectory of warming. That's radically different from where we are now, yet the general public don't really know about it. It's not something that we're talked about. And where has civil society's role been in not supporting that narrative that we need so importantly now? And also, have we as civil society provided governments with the right type of support? Or have we slipped into this formulaic dynamic where we criticize without offering solutions? And have we also siloed ourselves at the expense of seeing the bigger picture? And whilst it's really important to focus on that direct change that you want to have, as the book really clearly highlights, we also need to stand back and look from the balcony and reimagine the whole ecosystem of climate action. And with that, look to where civil society can best operate within the system, but also change the system itself. And I think we're really at a moment where we need much more political imagination and willingness to disrupt, and more honesty about what's working and what's not. And from a civil society perspective, I see this book as a key starting place to help us start thinking through a lot of these questions. So thank you, and back to you.
Wonderful, Gab. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. Excellent reflections. Thank you for that. Zach?
Sure. Hello. Thank you so much. I'll present a series of random points, reflections, and questions that I hope will make sense. First, I'll pick up on the gratitude thing, so I guess I can confer legitimacy on the panel. So for whatever I've achieved in my life, Felix in particular gets a big thanks to a strange night of coffee, wine, and nachos in London 20 years ago. But both Chris and Marie also. So, I can only say reading the book, it resonates, both personal experience, and I think it's a manual, but one that's written in an engaging way, and I think to the point was just made by Sophie in a really strategic way. And so I can only really encourage its reading and the value of its application in this place. I guess as I reflect a little bit, the book is written in a rather optimistic tone, which I appreciate in a pretty dark time. And so I guess I challenge you, Chris, to reflect a little bit more on the dark times in which we live. And I was in a meeting. Where was I? I was in Sevilla for FFT4, and I was in one of these stakeholder type meetings, and people were gathering, and they were saying we haven't done a good enough job communicating the return on investment of the UN. And I think that the challenge that those of us that are multilateralists have to ask ourselves also, though, is that it's pretty clear that the return on investment hasn't been high enough. And I think that's a question that we haven't necessarily grappled with in a strategic and serious way. And it's not enough to simply say that this is our last best hope and this is the thing that we should be doing because it's the right thing to do, and it is, but it's not good enough anymore. And whether where those questions are coming from or not are valid, it's one that we have to take seriously. And that's actually part of the point of multilateralism itself, is that we talk to everybody and that we're willing to engage them in serious ways to find the solutions that are needed. So I guess that's one I'd like to hear a little bit more. And that also then speaks to really, Felix, you were talking about, stakeholders confer legitimacy on a process. Well, why? And why now? And so I think that's something that's also really worth reflecting on. And as we think about this sort of evolving multilateralism, what is the new shape of that? Because I think what's also changed since the Mine Will Be a Cafe Latte book, and I think you recognize this in the book, is that the whole dynamic with stakeholders and member states and the UN system is totally different than it was 20 years ago. And there's a group of people now that are their own ecosystem and maybe part of the problem. And so, engaging in that and having a strategic way a thoughtful way of doing that is super important, but maybe that itself needs to evolve as well. Maybe another thing that'd be interesting to reflect on, and you do this a little bit in the book, and I appreciate it, but is what advice would you give to the UN and member states in their engagement with stakeholders? Because actually, their legitimacy is needed more than ever. And so what kind of posture would you say they should take as they think about this kind of engagement and what we want from our processes and systems? So yeah, maybe those are some dark questions, but I guess I'd just reiterate that my view is we live in a time of pretty extreme cynicism, but I really appreciate the hopeful tone of the book, and I agree with it and resonated. So I was actually very happy to read it in a time that I feel super sad. And so I hope that's something we can build on going forward, and we do need to believe in it to make it real. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Zach. Thanks. I want to turn to audience questions, but these are wonderful interventions and provocative thoughts. Any responses or reactions to things that have come up?
Oh, is this working? It is. Those were just such good interventions. Thank you. Really, maybe it's because of my EMB experience, but I found myself instantly taking notes and thinking, what can I be doing next to kind of pick up on these things? I thought, Zach's question about the fact that we are in dark times and is the book overly optimistic, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think the way my head is going is we can accept it. We can accept this kind of declaration, from certain people and this direction that certain leaders are taking us in. Or we can push back and forge a counter-narrative. And, I think communication is critical. I think reflection, I think engaging with stakeholders is critical. And I think we need to remind ourselves of just what the UN has already done and what multilateralism has done already. Because if we've done it before, we can do it again. I mean, this isn't the only moment times have been dark before. And this is why, and I'm just going to give a slightly shameless plug for another book that Felix and I worked on. But this was the purpose of this book, was to look at, it's called Heroes of Environmental Diplomacy. And Felix and I co-edited it. And part of the reason we did that was to remind ourselves in these dark times that, the UN has achieved remarkable things, and to give ourselves hope for the future that we can continue to do this. But I do think, Zach's onto something. We have to be forging a counter-narrative. And that's why I mentioned in my earlier statement, kind of just, I'm seeing a pushback against this narrative that we're living in a unilateral world now. We're living in a zero-sum game world now. We're living in a world of regionalism and great power politics, and we're going back to this kind of almost imperial age. Well, I don't think most people agree with that. I don't think most people see it that way. And so I think the UN gives a forum and a voice for us to start articulating that. But I do agree that we haven't figured out our strategy yet. We haven't figured out our tactics yet, and I think there's a lot more to be done in that regard. So I do agree on that.
Yeah, just a couple of additions to that. I mean, I think that, we've written this week about what to do with the conventions. There's a process where you can recognize and build on existing ideas that have been around, but perhaps over the time period have been lost in some way. So some good ideas to build for the future. But Zach's right. I mean, we haven't achieved enough in the time period. And there are kind of political reasons for that, in a sense, if you go back to 72, why wasn't 1972, why wasn't the Human Environmental Conference, why doesn't its outcomes implemented? Well, we had the war between Israel and the Middle East, and the oil prices went up. Why wasn't 92 implemented? Well, we had the Soviet Union fall apart, and we had the first Gulf War. Why wasn't 2002 implemented? Well, we had 9/11. And luckily for us, in a sense, we had a crisis in 2008. It was the financial crisis. But we started working, which is why we should be working now, on what should happen after the financial crisis. And, we were working in 2008 on the idea of a Rio +20, partly because President Lula had said we need a new summit on sustainable development. It gave us the leadership which we were able to kind of go into the slipstream world of it. So we need to now be really working on the future. I think, the chapter on on what it's like to be a government official was an attempt to do a bit of what you were suggesting. But it's like, we need to help the government officials to, in this more difficult time, be able to take more creative decisions. I mean, if you build the relationship, so I think in 1997 or 1998, when the discussions on the World Summit on Sustainable Development kicked off, I managed to persuade the US government to go to the toilet when the decision was being taken, so that they didn't vote against us having another summit, because they had actually congressional instructions to vote against the summit. So there are ways of building those relationships where, you can get people to do the right thing, or at least to not do the wrong thing. So it's not right or wrong sometimes. I won't mention the country, but a particular country was going to try and stop SDG 16, and I managed to persuade them with a number of coffees that perhaps that was a bad idea, and could they just not engage in it. And so we have a role as stakeholders, as basically as experts, to help the state, to help the countries to navigate this space. And remember, many of them are first-time people as well. And so the book in the governance thing says, well, you may have someone who's just joined as the counselor in a particular mission. I had this with Nigeria. The number 3 ambassador approached me at Habitat 3 and said, I don't know how the system works. Can you help me? And so you can help them, and then they pay you back. And out of that relationship, I got an annual General Assembly resolution on sustainable investment. So, there are ways to build in that. But we're not strategizing enough. We're not thinking through. The 2030 and beyond agenda potentially offers some of the space for that to happen.
Thank you for those reflections. I'd love to turn to the audience. This has been a rich discussion. It's covered a lot of different types of topics. I know we have practitioners in the audience and government representatives. What reflections or questions do you have for the panelists and discussants? Will you introduce yourself?
Thank you. So my name is Stephen Mandel. I'm a neurologist and fellow in occupational environmental medicine. So it's clear in the medical literature that climate change is now associated with a dramatic increase in many diseases, whether infectious diseases. For example, the incidence of Parkinson's is 50% higher in probably the last decade or two. But there is very little evidence-based medicine to show physicians and patients the true numbers, and therefore, how do you, as people in civil society, teach physicians who could educate patients to engage governments and other people to now be stakeholders and be involved?
Great question.
So I think there's always a need to educate in all the sectors at the national level. And so, we would advise the stakeholders that are engaged in health to be much more engaged in their country and with their government. I mean, too often in the global process, you'll have a stakeholder come to a meeting with their government, which they've not bothered to meet them back in the capital. I mean, there's no point in going to a global meeting to argue to your own government about something that you haven't already had a conversation with them back in capital, because otherwise they're not going to take you seriously. But I mean, health has grown up, in a sense, within the climate negotiations in the last 3 or 4 COPs. The problem we have with the climate negotiation, or a problem, we have many, but a problem, I think, in reflection, Tariq Benouria used to head one of the divisions here and was an IPCC lead author and won the Nobel Prize. He said, we made a mistake at the beginning. We should have done sectors. We should have done sectors in the Framework Convention, so there should have been a health sector, there should have been a transport sector, there should have been a tourism one. We could have had targets on these in the 1990s. Or even the early 2000s, we could have had local government trying to introduce things. So our approach, we've learned something from that, so let's feed that into the conversations for any new conventions.
I would just add that I think that's why the role of folks like you is so important, because we need Malcolm Gladwell talked about interlocutors, connectors, right? So we need folks who are connecting the UN world with what's happening at the national level, with what's happening with the research community. So I would just, I would endorse what you're doing and your efforts to join those dots together.
There's a question, two questions in the back. Oh, sorry. Oh, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Monica Nogara. I'm work in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. We've been working using strategic foresight, thinking about the governance futures. So what should we expect in terms of like looking at the current institutions, the failures of current institutions to actually address the challenges, today's challenges, and address the needs and aspirations of societies. So I would just thinking about what has been said by you and some of our the discussants in terms of the importance of the networks, and we have a much more networked societies, and how it will be very important to move from the actual forging of the agreements into actually the implementation. So how can we think in terms of what should be our multilateralism? What should be important? How can we use this network, more network societies, and maybe the role of other stakeholders are not states? How can actually this many other stakeholders and civil societies contribute to create a different kind of multilateralisms? What would you see in your world that could, because I think now we really need to move away from the agreements to the implementation. This has been a bit of the problem with current institutions failing in the implementation phase. But so what would be that implications of our multilateral system, a stronger multilateral system?
I mean, I think that's a great question, and it's one which I think we should all be reflecting on. But my reflection on that is you take the change process, and, we're now looking at a 1.5 to 2 degree world. So we do need new policies, because we've been assuming we could hit the 1.5. So the role of the UNFCCC as a normative body needs to continue. But the conversation that's now happening, of which Brazil is starting to implement some of this, is around what they call the blue zone. And so I think you'll see Brazil trying to force more of the pavilions in the blue zone to become more of the action agenda, where in fact they become, over a number of COPs, the place where you have the best practice, the good practice, the opportunity to move forward and implement. Because you don't want to mix the two. I think you need a separate space for it. I know your question is bigger than that, but in the climate stuff, I think Brazil's is trying to do that, and I think whoever gets COP31 and COP32 should move it further down that way. I think we have a problem in the sense that we have, 10,000 partnerships on the website for the SDGs, and I would say that they're not necessarily real. We don't have a proper monitoring and evaluation system. We have no way of seeing what they're doing. And when we've tried to get a proper system in there, there's been a pushback from member states. But we have that in the climate negotiations. Oxford University acts as a check on whether the partnerships or within the action agenda. We have it in nutrition, the work that David Nabarra is doing. We have that. We need to have a much more robust system that actually brings together. And so all the health, I'm taking health as an example, all the health partnerships should be meeting during the WHO assembly and actually sharing and building a different form of implementation. But I think it's a bigger question than I can answer.
Yeah, I mean, just to add briefly, I mean, I think some parts of the UN system have been very good at bringing stakeholders in and engaging with them for a long time. And I see some of that, I've seen some of that historically here in New York. I think what you're, getting at, Monica, and I agree with you, is that we are moving from this kind of stage where we have agreed a ton of stuff, right? And now we need to kind of do that stuff. So how does the UN encourage engagement, and also how do we hold governments and others up to to their promises and keep them to. I mean, I would from the UN standpoint, I think, you as a UN staffer might know a lot more about this than I do, but I would say, as a kind of peripherally involved outsider and long-time observer, I would say keep doing what you're doing, keep bringing civil society voices to these meetings, keep giving them opportunities to hold governments to account. I think that that's critically important, and I do think that this is a moment for us to be reflecting on how we do more of this, and do we need new tactics now that we're moving into this new phase?
Just one thing to add. There was a period of kind of where we did something really, really good, and then it stopped. Okay, and so from 1998 to 2002, during what was then the Commission on Sustainable Development, we had a proper 2-week preparatory period, and then we were 2 weeks of negotiations. The first 2 days were given over to multi-stakeholder dialogues with ministers on the issues. And in the second one of that, when Simon Upton was the chair of the Commission on Sustainable Development, he entered the chair's summary of that dialogue into the negotiations as a New Zealand position. So 70% of the decision on tourism came from the dialogue. So there's some models out there that we've forgotten that could be done. And I think, we're no longer doing negotiations properly here, but I think having a period where the stakeholders can actually have a dialogue, and we had 9 stakeholder groups, but we had to negotiate among ourselves for no more than 3 or 4.
We have a few questions in the back, but since this is such a big one in core, I wonder if Sophie or Zach have any reflections.
Yeah. Oh, loud. Sorry. No, thank you for the question. I think I'm currently strategy lead at the Mobilising an Earth Governance Alliance, and this is exactly the question that we're seeking to tackle. So we're looking at what of the current sort of environmental governance architecture in a very big picture way is working, and do we need to strengthen? And where do we need to think about really being innovative and looking to the next generation institutions that we're going to need? And I think some of the things that this is the way in which we're doing that. We have the different areas and work streams that we're working on more specifically within that. But one of the sort of cross-cutting things that we're seeing is around the role of law. And I think it's very easy to dismiss international law as sort of, no one really pays attention and who cares. But actually, if you look at the evidence, it's quite contrary to that. And we have, the International Court of Justice coming out with their advisory opinion next week on the responsibility of states, and thinking that, okay, how do we use that to then build a momentum across all sort of levels of law, and more broadly outside of that, and have this sort of multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary approach to really build off this momentum. So I think the role of law is really key in this, particularly when we're talking about the implementation piece and holding people and countries to account. But equally, I think the method that we use within the Alliance is around smart coalitions, and we do see a disruption of where power lies at the moment, and thinking about how we can leverage that to our advantage to think about the new systems that we need and start shifting the system as a whole. And I think there's great innovation obviously in disruption, and I think what we're seeing at the moment is that we've got a window. There's obviously dark times that I think we've discussed, and I very much agree with that, but I do think we have a window of opportunity at the moment to create something better. And I think we need to use it now, because after, let's say, around 4 years, we could end up with something that's actually much worse than where we are right now. So, I think I would love to continue the conversation with you. Yeah.
Question over back here.
Hello, I'm just back from the Finance for Development Forum meeting in Seville, and it was very hard actually to see the stakeholders at that meeting. For the most part, I think that there was an opening and a rethinking of the financial system. But like you mentioned, these are big systems. They take lots of money, but they need integrated plans with energy, agriculture, biodiversity, climate, the oceans, and the people represented in making these plans on the large-scale choices. So how can we move in the stakeholders that represent NGOs and people into these sector dialogues? And also, how do we scale and interface the create an interface so that the scale of finance that is actually needed to address climate is addressed. Like I brought up the Exeter actuarial study on global boundaries to the Security Council, but they didn't want to introduce a regular, like, even report on where we are in the global boundaries. And this is seriously starting to be a target and a threat that we can now measure. So anyway.
I wonder, are there other questions out there? Just in case there's one, I can grab it before our time. Yes, maybe we'll
thank
take
you.
two at the same. Oh, another one.
My question was about how the national priorities are formed. So what's the role of individuals, how transparent they are, how self-aware the national governments are about their priorities, and how much space there is for influence from the lobbyists, as you mentioned, some quite important influences that you had. Thank you.
And then there's one more here in the front. If Mike is coming. Yeah.
I'm not sure I need it, but thank you. Oh. No, I just want to confirm that our friend Felix has been a master at building relationships, and he has been ubiquitous in the UN system, and he was even that good that sometimes as a staff member of the UN I had to go to him for information on what was happening in the house. But now I'm on the other side. I'm now working for a group of small states, and just wanted to raise the question of how you, as an influencer, lobbyist, what is your strategy for dealing with smaller states? They don't have the political capital to influence much, although, someone just referred to the ICJ ruling that's coming. That was, something that came from smaller states. But I wondered if you have had or have an approach to dealing with smaller states in lobbying for change. Thank you.
As you reflect on these three questions, I also wonder, we'll wrap up the conversation, and there'll be time for people who would like to, come and dialogue a little bit more. But also maybe in the spirit of answering these, what is a story or two of a really high point that you have experienced in this world of multilateral stakeholder engagement that gives you the hope and drive to know that this type of thing is achievable going forward? So some of the questions that are reflected here are quite, tactical. Some of them are big, but also just give us a little bit of an anecdote or two from your vast experience of a time when you said, yes, wow, we did that, right? Because I think that's what gives us also the energy and encouragement to keep going. But maybe the questions were around national priorities, small island states, and the Seville negotiations.
So on kind of the situation with Oasis, I guess, you've got some important friends in the establishment. You have the Chief of Staff for the Secretary General. You have Selwyn as Assistant Secretary General. You have the head of the UNFCCC. So it's not like you haven't got friends who can help you move those agendas forward. But I know what you mean. And I think, sometimes there are NGOs or stakeholders have come on to some of the islands' delegations to help be experts for that, but maybe some of that needs to be a little bit more formalized, and some NGOs could offer to be much more supportive of the small island states, because you can't take, I don't know how many the US used to take to COPs, but they took hundreds of people. And I think for the COPs, you only get paid for 2 people to go or something like that. There's not a large number of funds that go there. So there needs to be more of a thinking about which think tanks could help you to kind of build a stronger team to go in there. I think that would be really important. I think on the Seville stuff, I mean, my feeling was that the FFD process went the wrong way in Ethiopia. I think, and I argued at the time, that what we should have done is had the SDGs as the framework, and then we should have then worked out what needed to be financed under each of the SDGs. So that was one thing that I think would have then helped money go to those SDGs. Some of it would be public, some of it would have been a mixture of public-private. And then I think what we failed to do was to have, instead of the usual groupings, I think we needed a grouping of the LLDCs. And what did the LLDCs need? What do the LDCs need? As opposed to, in a sense, the Africa group, the Latin American group, the Asia group. I think we needed to get down to that. And then what role for the future do the private sector play? Because overseas development aid is going down, and so clearly we need to have a way of ensuring whatever investment is going is not greenwash. And so we need proper rules around what investment companies should go in to help build whatever they're going to build. So, for example, in Kenya, we looked at a blue economy investment facility with the government, and the idea was you didn't get onto the investment facility unless you were certified. So if you were doing a fisheries process, you would have to be certified by the Marine Stewardship Council, and that there will be a grant-making system to support you being able to get to the point of that, and that you couldn't be an investor to come onto the platform unless you were a signatory of the Principles for Responsible Investors. And if, therefore, you stop the bad investors from coming in. So you stop greenwash and blue wash, but you also get good investors. All of those conversations are going to have to move forward. I didn't go to FFD, and clearly Zach is still suffering from it, and he may want to make some comments on it. But the example, I guess, would be the SDGs. I'd done the background paper for a retreat in Solo, Indonesia for UN DESA on the reform of UNEP and the reform of the Commission on Sustainable Development. And Paulo Caballero made a speech there for the first time calling for the Sustainable Development Goals. And then I was chairing a conference 2 months later, a UN conference in Bonn. We reorganized it to come forward with a set of SDGs. Because it was a UN conference, even though the people there were stakeholders, then our suggestions became part of the policy briefs that were done for Rio Plus 20. So it enabled a conversation to happen. And we fought against the development NGOs who were all against the SDGs. I think even Save the Children Fund didn't join and support the SDGs to the final negotiation. So there was a battle, and we won the battle. We supported Colombia, Guatemala, the United Arab Emirates and Peru, who were pushing it forward. And I think we made a substantive change because the SDGs were about everybody, not the MDGs are about just developing countries. The SDGs are about interlinkages, and it's about building an agenda which we all contributed to. Now, we didn't necessarily contribute as much as we could have done, but we didn't know the opportunities were there. But I think it was a huge success.
Thank you. So I would just follow up on what Felix said about with respect to small states. Felix mentioned coalitions and networks, and I think we are more effective when we work together. And I think those, and I recall from the past, for instance, with small island developing states in the climate negotiations, there was this great collaboration with Field. I'm not sure, I haven't been to the last couple of COPs, but it was they had lawyers on their team who were volunteers and worked for a non-profit, and it was a terrific collaboration. So not just that the AOSIS network is fantastic, but even pulling in from other stakeholders, I think, is that's how we get to our real strength. with respect to the questions about FFD and kind of, I think the question about kind of influencing at the national level, and two of the things that we talk about a lot in the book are people and preparation. You know, it's about building relationships, and it's about incredibly thorough preparation, and you know, looking, you know, even not just months, but even years out from a major event, and saying, okay, how do we get to that point, you know, where we're successful at a major conference? And Felix said, you know, if you're meeting the delegates for the first time at the conference, it's already too late. You know, those things need to be happening well in advance. So people in preparation would be a big kind of message that I would leave you with. And then a story. So I was racking my brain because, you know, in my 27 years working in this field, I think I'm kind of a jinx for a lot of meetings. I'm kind of like the bad luck guy because I missed Kyoto by a year, right? So that was, in my view, that was a successful, I really began us on a really positive path. I missed Paris. You know, I missed some of the really big ones. I started covering the SDGs, but I wasn't there for the finale. I was in Copenhagen, biggest climate change conference, 2009, expected to be hugely successful. It was not. It was a train wreck of a meeting, incredibly depressing. 8 years earlier, 2001, in The Hague, the Netherlands, there was a big climate meeting. That was supposed to be a breakout success. No, but I was there. So I think, yeah, I'm a little nervous that perhaps I bring bad luck. I try and avoid the ones now where I think they're supposed to succeed. But a more recent story. So last week I was helping out, I mentioned ENB, the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. I was helping out a team that was in Bangkok for a meeting of the Montreal Protocol, Ozone Layers Open-Ended Working Group. And I was editing it virtually from my house in San Francisco. And I was nervous because I was working with the team. I was asking them, how are you doing? I was checking their web page. I edited the final report. And I was nervous that the change in geopolitics that we have seen recently would translate through and have an impact, a negative impact, on what has been a remarkably successful process. But guess what? It didn't. People there were, and the message I got from my colleagues who were on the ground there were, people are invested in this. People are more invested than ever because they want to show that multilateralism works. They want to continue to protect and bring back the ozone layer, and they are dedicated to this. And so that's just, you know, that just happened this last weekend when I was reading the report, and I thought, these guys actually achieved quite a lot, and it made me optimistic for the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. I want to thank everybody for being here, and I hope you'll stick around to buy a copy of the book and talk a little bit more, have it signed. I'd like to thank Mary Ellen Glenn and her team for hosting it here at the bookshop. Sophie and Zach for your excellent interventions, and to Chris and Felix for writing what is really a consequential book, and one that you don't read once. You have it for a while, and you keep referring to it over and over. So thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And again, the books are available at the registers. Please buy a copy. Have them sign it, personalize it for you. And thank you for writing the book. It's great. Books are such a great way to get the message, multilateralism, the United Nations out there. So we greatly appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for coming.